Hi everyone. Even though they're not as common in homes these days, most people probably still recognize this type of clock. A clock like this is known as a grandfather clock, or grandfather's clock. They were developed in the 1670s by English clockmaker William Clement, who discovered how to use a new mechanism to allow for a very narrow swing of a clock's pendulum. This development, in turn, allowed clockmakers to use longer pendulums, which led to this long, tall shape, but which also allowed for fewer windings of the clock, caused less friction and wear in the clockworks, and meant the clock was very accurate. In fact, these clocks were the most accurate timekeeping devices between the 1670s and the early 20th century. And while these clocks were initially very expensive, by the 1800s, lower costs and rising wages had made them accessible to middle-class families. So, for several hundred years, these iconic, tall, standing clocks were a widespread household appliance. But for the vast majority of that time, they were not actually known as grandfather clocks. So, what were they initially called? Where did the name grandfather clock come from? And why did it catch on? Let's find out. Initially, these clocks were known by a couple of different names, including floor clock, tall case clock, and perhaps most commonly, long case clock. And these names all make sense. These clocks sat on the floor instead of a shelf, or being attached to the wall, and had a tall or long case, which was necessary to house the long pendulum. But this all changed in 1876, when an Origipop song titled Grandfather's Clock was published. This song was one of the later songs written by popular songwriter of the time, Henry Clay Work. Work had begun his songwriting career a few decades earlier as a bit of a hobby while he was working as a printer, first in Hartford, Connecticut, then in Chicago. Besides Grandfather's Clock, his most famous and popular songs were actually written during and about the Civil War. Work's father had been a fervent abolitionist, and his childhood home was actually a stop on the Underground Railroad. Work followed in his father's footsteps and supported the anti-slavery cause of the North through the songs he wrote. Such songs championing this cause include 1862's Kingdom Coming, which is sung from the point of view of Southern slaves whose master has run away from the approaching Union troops. Babylon is Fallen from 1863, which tells of freed slaves joining the Union Army and fighting against the Confederates. And 1865's Marching Through Georgia, whose lyrics referred to Sherman's March to the Sea, a famous battle which resulted in the capture of the port city of Savannah, Georgia. Work also wrote a famous temperance song, Come Home Father, in 1864, and The Ship That Never Returned in 1865, a song that later had its tune adapted for two separate songs. The Wreck on the Southern Old 97, commonly just known as Wreck of the Old 97, and a song poking fun at Boston's subway system, the MTA, commonly referred to as Charlie on the MTA. But Work's most famous, impactful, and long-lasting song is probably 1876's Grandfather's Clock, often commonly known as My Grandfather's Clock. This song was allegedly inspired by a real clock in a hotel in England. The story goes that while Work was traveling in England, he stopped at the George Hotel in northeast England and saw a long case clock that had stopped working. When he asked about it, he was told that the clock and hotel had, in the past, been owned by two brothers, and when the first one died, the clock started slowing down, and when the second died, aged 90, it stopped working altogether. This story apparently inspired Work to write the song Grandfather's Clock. Now, I don't know how true this story is. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the George Hotel itself claims the story is true, and even says this is the actual grandfather clock that inspired Work. But while I found several variations of this story through various sources, I didn't find any primary or academic sources that back this up. But regardless of the origin of the song, Grandfather's Clock does tell a story very similar to this one that Work apparently heard over in England. Let's take a quick look at the lyrics to learn a bit more about this story. There are 4 verses and a chorus. I won't sing all the verses, but let's at least do the first one. My grandfather's clock was too large for the shelf, so it stood 90 years on the floor. It was taller by half than the old man himself, though it weighed not a pennyweight more. It was bought on the morn of the day that he was born, and was always his treasure and pride. But it stopped short, never to go again, when the old man died. So, this first verse tells us a bit about the clock, clarifying, along with the picture from the sheet music cover, that it's a long case clock, and says that it was bought the same day as the grandfather was born, and ends, as does every verse, by explaining that the clock stopped working right when the grandfather died. This basic idea continues in the chorus, originally written for 4-part harmony, which runs, 90 years without slumbering, tick, 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 his life seconds numbering, tick, 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 it stopped short, never to go again when the old man died. So the chorus just sort of reaffirms what we just learned in the verse. The lives of the clock and the grandfather are sort of intertwined. And this idea is furthered by the other 3 verses, where we learn that the clock seemed to share the grandfather's grief and joy, was faithful or accurate for him, and that it chimed 24 times when the grandfather entered the house with his new wife on the day of his wedding. And in the last verse, it shares that when the grandfather was near death, the clock rang an alarm to let the family know he was about to pass away. So they all gather by his bed, and the clock continues to work, quietly ticking in reverence, right up until the grandfather actually does die. So, that's the story of the song. And as silly or quaint as the story might seem to us now, it was extraordinarily popular at the time. It sold over 800,000 copies and earned Work $4,000, which is equivalent to over $100,000 today. Its popularity even led Work to publish a sequel to the song 2 years later, imaginatively titled Sequel to Grandfather's Clock. This song told of how the original clock was sold for scrap by the home's new owners and replaced with a clock referred to in the song as a vain, stuck-up thing on the wall. But this song was not nearly as successful as its predecessor. And the original song continued to be popular for decades after. In 1905, it was first recorded by the Edison Quartet on an old cylinder record. Here's a bit of what that version sounds like.
90 years without slumbering, his life seconds numbering, it stopped, never to go again, when the old man died.
And since then, it has been recorded by over 100 different artists, including Burl Ives, Johnny Cash, and Bing Crosby. And it has continually popped up in various areas of popular culture. In 1962, Fisher-Price released this clock toy, which had a music box inside which played the chorus of Grandfather's Clock. There were a few different versions of this released throughout the years, like this recolored version, which sold from 64 to 67, this redesigned one, which was available between 68 and 83, and this more plasticky version from the mid-90s. But all of them played this iconic song. And Fisher-Price has even brought back the third one we looked at, and it's still available to purchase today at places like Amazon. The song also served as the inspiration for an episode of The Twilight Zone from 1963. The 12th episode of Season 5 was titled 90 Years Without Slumbering, taken from the first line of the chorus, and is about an old man who is convinced that when his grandfather clock, which he's had since the day he was born, stops working, he'll die. This episode has a bit of a happier ending than the song, though, as he ultimately realizes that it's all in his head, and when the clock does stop, he doesn't die, but in fact feels like he was born again. And this song has been used in countless movies, television programs, and even video games. It has certainly maintained a place in our popular culture even now, almost 150 years after it was first written. But arguably the biggest impact this song has had on our society and culture is how it essentially renamed this type of clock. According to Merriam-Webster, this term came from this song and was first used in 1883, and it was probably due to the popularity and ubiquitousness of the song in those first few years after its publication. And this term became so popular that clockmakers and enthusiasts even now refer to shorter versions of this type of clock as grandmother clocks, and even shorter ones as granddaughter clocks. And just as an aside, while we're talking about heights, the world's tallest grandfather clock is 35 feet 10 inches tall and is located in Kewaunee, Wisconsin. Anyways, that's the story of the Origipop song Grandfather's Clock and how it came to rename an iconic piece of antique furniture. And now if you see one of these old clocks anywhere, Now you can annoy your friends with some random trivia about it. Thanks for watching.